You were the brilliant child. Everyone praised, now you don't know who you are. Carl Jung. Everyone praised you for being brilliant. You were the golden child, the prodigy, the one with all the answers. But now you're lost, numb, unfulfilled. Carl Jung warned us, when you spend your life becoming who the world wants, you forget who you are. This video is for the gifted soul who's quietly falling apart and finally ready to come home to themselves. Part 1, the glorified childhood and the mask of being the special one. In Jungian psychology, the construction of the persona, the mask we wear for the outer world, often begins in childhood, for the brilliant child. This mask forms with astonishing speed. This child is the one who is praised constantly, admired for their intelligence, talent, or emotional maturity. On the surface, everything looks perfect. The child receives admiration from parents, teachers, relatives, and often becomes the family's pride. But beneath this mask, something subtle and dangerous is happening. The child is slowly losing access to their true inner self. When a child is consistently rewarded for being exceptional, they start to equate love and attention with performance. This performance may be academic, artistic, athletic, or simply emotional precocity. The problem is not the praise itself. Praise can be healthy in moderation, but the conditioning. You are only loved when you succeed. You matter because you're gifted. You're special, and that's why we're proud of you. The moment praise becomes conditional, the child begins to fear their own imperfections. This is where the persona grows, a carefully shaped image of brilliance that the child now feels obligated to maintain. Jung emphasized that the persona is necessary for society. It's how we function in roles. But when the persona is mistaken for the self, we suffer. The brilliant child is at high risk for this confusion. The child learns not to feel anger, not to cry too loudly, not to fail, and not to express confusion. Every mistake threatens their image. Over time, they stop exploring who they truly are. They become the child everyone else wants them to be, not the person they are becoming inside. The brilliant child begins to develop a deep dependency on external validation. Their identity becomes fused with feedback. They're often not praised for who they are, but for what they do. For example, a child might show a drawing and receive attention not because they enjoyed creating it, but because it was so much better than other kids. Suddenly, joy turns into pressure. They're no longer creating out of pleasure, they're creating to maintain status. This experience turns into a loop. The child works hard to stay on top, to remain impressive, but each time they meet expectations, the bar is raised eventually. This leads to emotional exhaustion. And because their identity is built on the persona of being brilliant, they can't stop. Slowing down feels like failure. Asking for help feels like weakness. Admitting they're unsure feels like they're losing themselves. This child, now an adolescent or adult, eventually reaches a point of disorientation. When the praise stops or when life no longer rewards their brilliance, they begin to feel empty. It's as if they've built a castle on sand. They've performed, impressed, and succeeded. But when asked, "Who are you really?" they can't answer because they never learned who they were outside of being extraordinary. Jung believed that when we are cut off from the self, the psyche begins to rebel. Anxiety, depression, compulsive behaviors, and even identity crises emerge, not necessarily because something is wrong, but because something is missing. The true self is trying to make itself known beneath the persona that has ruled for years. Let's break this down further using Jung's idea of the individuation process, the lifelong journey of becoming who we truly are. For the brilliant child, individuation is delayed. Their development is borrowed from the expectations of others, rather than exploring their shadow, their unconscious, their real desires. They spend years curating an image. This results in deep psychological fragmentation. Part of them knows they're living a lie, but they're terrified of being normal, average, or unremarkable. So they keep going even when it hurts. This is where we see the emergence of perfectionism, imposter syndrome, and people-pleasing behaviors. These adults were once brilliant children who received love only when they excelled. As adults, they now seek perfection not out of passion, but fear. They don't feel allowed to rest, to fail, or even to change direction. They remain trapped in careers, relationships, or social circles that reinforce their early persona, even if they feel dead inside. Jung would say this person is at war with themselves. The self, the wholeness of who they are, is trying to surface. But the ego, which clings to the persona of brilliance, resists. And every moment spent in that resistance amplifies inner suffering. Here's an example Jung might have appreciated. A young girl praised for being the smartest in class, becomes a lawyer because it maintains her family's pride. She doesn't hate law, but she doesn't love it either. Years later, she feels numb, exhausted, and confused. She goes to therapy. Her therapist asks, "What do you want?" She freezes. She has no idea. For 30 years, she's only wanted what others expected her to want. Her feelings, dreams, and longings have been buried beneath years of expectations. This is a classic result of what Jung called over-identification with the persona. Another key idea in Jungian theory is the shadow. The shadow is the collection of traits we reject or repress. For the brilliant child, the shadow often contains vulnerability, laziness, uncertainty, jealousy, and anger. These are traits they were discouraged from showing. So the child learns, I must always be composed. I must always know the answer. I must always shine. But the cost of this repression is high. The shadow does not disappear. It grows in the dark, and eventually, it shows up through anxiety, mood swings, burnout, or sudden emotional outbursts. Adults who were brilliant children often struggle with authenticity. They fear being found out, that others will see their flaws. They may keep up an image of success even when internally they're collapsing. They avoid asking for help because their persona depends on self-sufficiency. Jung wrote that the shadow must be integrated, not defeated. Integration means acknowledging our limitations without shame. For the brilliant adult, this is a terrifying process, but it's the only way to heal. Another symptom of this inner split is emotional disconnection. Many gifted children are so focused on achievement that they become emotionally neglected even by well-meaning parents. No one asks them, "How are you really feeling?" They're praised for their grades, but not for their humanity. Over time, they learn to bypass emotion and intellectualize everything. They become highly competent adults who can't cry, can't express need, and can't sit with discomfort. Jung believed that healing comes from reconnecting with the inner world. For the brilliant child turned adult, this means looking back, not to blame, but to understand. When did they first learn that love had to be earned? When did they stop playing just for the joy of it? When did they stop being a child and become a performer? This process of self-inquiry is painful. It requires grieving the lost years. It requires letting go of the illusion that being perfect will make you feel whole. And it requires courage to become ordinary, at least temporarily, while you discover your real self beneath the roles you've played. Jung once said, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely." For the brilliant child, this is doubly true, because they were taught to accept only their success, their light, and their performance. Accepting the full self flawed, uncertain, emotional, and messy feels like failure at first. But in truth, it's freedom. This is why many people who are gifted children report feeling more lost in adulthood than their peers. While others spent their younger years stumbling, failing, and learning from real life, the gifted child was too busy maintaining an image. So now, as adults, they don't have a well-developed sense of inner direction. They have technical skills but no internal compass. They must now do what Jung considered sacred: descend into the unconscious. Meet the shadow, integrate the parts that were denied. Only then can the self emerge. In truth, the brilliant child is not doomed, but they are often delayed. Their real growth begins when they stop chasing admiration and start chasing truth, when they allow themselves to be raw, to be real, and to be reformed. And the first step in that process is recognizing that the praise they received was not the problem. The belief that their worth depended on it, that was the real wound. Part 2, when the spotlight fades, the identity crisis of the gifted adult. There's a hidden panic that hits many high-achieving adults, one that begins quietly. Often in moments of stillness, you're lying in bed, and a question flashes through your mind like a siren. Who am I if I'm no longer impressive? This is the moment when the spotlight fades and the deep identity crisis begins. Carl Jung predicted this psychological rupture long before we had language for it. It's what he described as the dissolution of the inflated ego, especially when the ego has been built upon a socially praised persona rather than an integrated sense of self. The child who was once labeled brilliant, exceptional, or wise beyond their years often grows into an adult with one dangerous blind spot: they've been conditioned to survive through performance. Their identity was never fully formed, it was assigned. And because it was based on external validation, it was never grounded in internal truth. When the outer world stops applauding, or worse, when it starts demanding something different, the identity built on achievement begins to crack. This is the exact place where many gifted children turned adults begin to feel emotionally paralyzed. Their old methods excelling, outperforming, achieving don't bring satisfaction anymore. Promotions don't bring peace. Compliments feel hollow. They reach goals and feel nothing. That numbness is not laziness or ingratitude. It's a symptom of misalignment between the persona and the true self. Jung called this a neurosis of authenticity. It's not always dramatic, it doesn't always involve a nervous breakdown. In fact, it often looks like quiet sadness, a slow drain of vitality, a disinterest in life that wasn't there before. These adults often function on the outside but feel dead on the inside. They've hit what Jung called the midlife transition. But for former gifted children, it often comes earlier. It can happen at 25, 30, or 35, any point when the old structure no longer holds meaning. This collapse often brings up existential questions. Why don't I feel fulfilled even when I'm succeeding? Why do I feel so lost when others think I have it all together? What would I do if no one were watching me? These are terrifying questions for someone who's never built a self separate from the gaze of others. Jung believed that this point of breakdown is also a point of opportunity. It is the threshold into the process of individuation, where the unconscious begins to demand integration. Individuation, in Jung's model, is not a luxury, it's a necessity for mental and spiritual health. It's the journey of becoming whole, not just functional, but to begin it. The brilliant adult has to face a difficult truth. The person they've become is not necessarily who they are. And that realization often triggers grief, fear, and even shame. After all, if they're not the overachiever, the golden child, the dependable one, then who exactly are they? Here's where Jungian therapy often begins, not by analyzing problems, but by dismantling identities. The therapist might gently ask, when did you first feel like you had to be extraordinary to be loved? Or what parts of yourself did you have to hide to stay admired? These questions pierce the armor. They touch the old wounds that were never healed, just managed. Most people assume childhood praise is harmless, but for gifted children, over-identification with praise becomes a trap. It locks them into a contract, be impressive, or lose connection. And so, when they grow into adults, they feel deeply unsafe being ordinary. They fear being unremarkable, which is tragic because it means they fear being authentic. That's why the brilliant child, now grown, might pursue advanced degrees, high-level careers, or perfectionistic hobbies not out of passion, but out of a subconscious need to protect their value. Eventually, however, this leads to burnout. Not the kind of burnout that rest cures, it's existential. They're not just tired, they're lost. Even if they quit their job or take a break, the emotional fatigue persists because it wasn't the job that caused it. It was the fact that their whole identity has been serving a role they no longer believe in. In Jungian terms, this moment signals a need to break down the false self. The ego, which has been inflated by accomplishments and approval, must deflate. This is frightening, but also necessary. Jung wrote, "We cannot change anything unless we accept it. Condemnation does not liberate, it oppresses." In other words, the adult must stop judging themselves for no longer wanting what they used to crave. They must allow the confusion, the sadness, the blank spaces where old desires used to live. This is also the phase where inner conflict intensifies. The adult might feel pulled in two directions. One part wants to explore, rest, and be honest. The other part screams at them to keep performing, keep achieving, keep pleasing. This inner war is between the persona and the self, between the social mask and the soul. It is here that Jung's concept of the shadow becomes more than theory. The adult begins to meet all the parts they disowned: the scared child, the angry teenager, the tired perfectionist. They realize how long they've been neglecting themselves. They start to notice how often they say yes when they want to say no, how often they smile when they're numb, how much energy they spend maintaining a reputation they don't even enjoy. And slowly, they begin to reclaim something sacred: their autonomy. They stop outsourcing identity to achievements. They begin asking, what excites me now? Who am I when I'm not useful? What do I value beyond recognition? These are not easy questions, especially for those who were raised to perform. The fear of disappointing others is real. The fear of becoming mediocre is real. But as Jung said, the goal is not to become successful in the eyes of the world, it's to become whole in the eyes of the self. Here's an example. A man who was praised as a child for being the responsible one grows into a high-functioning, respected professional. He never lets people down. He's reliable, disciplined, successful. But one day, his wife leaves him, not because he failed, but because he was never really present emotionally. He was a ghost. He was always chasing productivity. In therapy, he breaks down and admits, I don't know what I feel. I just know how to get things done. This is a man who has lost himself in the performance of competence. He has mastered doing, but forgotten how to be. For gifted adults, this is a common story. Their competence becomes a cage. They are rewarded for it, but it becomes the only thing people see. They feel invisible as human beings. No one asks how they're doing, they just assume they're fine. After all, they're the brilliant ones. But brilliance without self-awareness becomes a burden. It leads to a hollow kind of success, one where achievements pile up, but meaning disappears. The work of healing, then, is not to become brilliant again. It's to become real. And being real often means being messy, uncertain, emotional, slow. It means dropping the act. It means reconnecting with the parts of yourself that aren't impressive but are true. Jung called this the descent into the unconscious, a sacred journey that every soul must eventually make. For the gifted adult, this descent often feels like failure. But in truth, it is a return to self, a return to wholeness. As the old identity dissolves, a new one begins to form slowly, organically, from within. It is not built on grades, promotions, or applause. It is built on presence, self-compassion, and truth. And the adult who dares to take this journey discovers something astonishing. They don't have to be brilliant to be worthy. They never did. Part 3, the shadow of brilliance, what the gifted child had to bury to survive. Carl Jung warned that the brighter the light, the darker the shadow. For the gifted child, this shadow doesn't develop because of neglect or abuse in the traditional sense. It develops because of conditional love, because excellence is rewarded while vulnerability, imperfection, and emotional complexity are ignored or suppressed. The child, in essence, becomes a symbol of brilliance, not a fully seen human being. In Jungian terms, the shadow is everything within us that we disown, deny, or reject. It is not necessarily bad, and it is simply what doesn't fit the persona we construct for survival. For the brilliant child, their persona is built around being smart, talented, kind, mature, composed, or emotionally advanced. Anything that contradicts those attributes gets repressed into the shadow. That means the gifted child's shadow often contains fear and anxiety, jealousy and competitiveness, laziness or desire to rest, anger, rebellion, and frustration, the craving to be ordinary, the need to fail and be loved anyway. These feelings are human, but they feel threatening to a child who's rewarded for being above normal. So the child begins to split. One part performs the brilliance, the other part, the hidden part, holds the guilt, confusion, and rage that no one sees. And the more successful the child becomes, the more intense the shadow grows. Let's look at this through Jung's concept of psychic balance. He believed the psyche, like nature, seeks equilibrium. When a person over-identifies with light, competence, or perfection, the unconscious compensates by generating dreams, fantasies, impulses, or symptoms rooted in the opposite. That's why highly successful, gifted people often have chaotic inner lives nightmares, panic attacks, depressive episodes, or sudden self-destructive urges. These aren't flaws, they're signals. The shadow is demanding recognition. Take the example of a teenage boy known for his academic brilliance and politeness. Everyone sees him as the ideal son, but secretly, he fantasizes about destroying his own image. He imagines failing on purpose, screaming at his parents, or disappearing from school. He doesn't act on these thoughts, but they terrify him. He thinks something is wrong with him. But Jung would say, no, something is trying to be heard. That's his shadow. His unconscious is protesting the inhuman standard he's trying to maintain. Now fast forward, that boy becomes a man. He lands a prestigious job, gets married, buys the house. But inside, he feels like he's suffocating. He's never allowed himself to rest. He can't tolerate boredom. He has no idea what pleasure even means unless it's productive. And worst of all, he feels like a fraud, because his inner world, the one filled with questions, contradictions, and dark emotions, has never been integrated. This is the curse of brilliance when shadow is denied. You become two people. The outer self that succeeds, the inner self that seethes. In Jungian therapy, shadow integration is not about fixing yourself, it's about reclaiming the parts of you you were forced to abandon. The former gifted child often has to reclaim the right to be confused, the right to be mediocre, the right to ask for help, the right to feel resentment, the right to rest without guilt. This sounds simple, but it's incredibly difficult. These are the very things that were unsafe to express in childhood. These were the things that threatened the love and admiration they depended on. One of the most powerful realizations in Jungian work is this: the shadow is not the enemy. It is the gatekeeper of wholeness. Until you reclaim your shadow, you cannot become a full person. You're only a fragment of yourself, even if that fragment is shiny and impressive. And the shadow doesn't stay quiet forever. It leaks out in ways that sabotage your relationships, your self-worth, and your peace of mind. That's why high-functioning adults who are gifted children often experience passive-aggressive behavior, self-sabotage right before success, rage toward authority, envy masked as perfectionism, cynicism that hides deep sadness, a need to dominate or outsmart others. These are not random flaws. These are exiled emotions seeking expression. They emerge because the psyche is trying to balance itself. The ego tries to suppress them. But Jung knew what you resist persists. Shadow work doesn't mean indulging your worst instincts. It means facing them with compassion. It means saying, yes, I was a smart kid, but I was also scared. I was also angry. I was also exhausted. And all those parts deserve to exist. Here's an example Jung would deeply resonate with: a gifted adult, now in her 30s, has always been the strong one in her family. She's emotionally competent, the problem solver, the peacemaker. She's never allowed to break down. But in private, she begins to experience random panic attacks. She hides them. One day, she's driving home and has a full-blown breakdown on the side of the road. She thinks she's lost control. But in truth, her shadow, her vulnerability, her need for care, her suppressed fear is finally breaking through the facade. When this happens, most people panic. They think they're falling apart. But from a Jungian view, this is the beginning of becoming whole. The ego cannot hold back the unconscious forever. And when the unconscious breaks through, it doesn't mean you're broken, it means you're finally being invited to heal. But this healing requires radical honesty. You have to admit the cost of being brilliant, that you never learned to fail gracefully, that you fear disappointing people more than death, that you resent the praise that once made you feel loved, that your identity was never freely chosen. And once you admit that, you must begin the process of shadow integration. In practice, that means when journaling about traits you dislike in others, they're often parts of your own shadow. 2. Noticing recurring themes in your dreams, especially dark or chaotic ones. 3. Examining emotional triggers. What enrages or shames you easily? Or giving yourself permission to be unproductive, to say no, to feel things that don't make sense. Most importantly, it means developing a new relationship with imperfection. Jung wrote that the path to the self is not a straight line. It is a spiral of death and rebirth, loss and rediscovery, and for the brilliant adult. The hardest part of that spiral is embracing ordinariness. This is the paradox. The child who was praised for being exceptional must now become fully human. They must descend into the emotions, the fears, and the impulses they've spent a lifetime denying. Only then can they rise not as an image, but as a person. The shadow is not evil, it is honest. And when you make peace with it, you stop being haunted by the very parts of yourself that once terrified you. You gain access to real intimacy, to creative freedom, and to inner peace, not because you're perfect, but because you're whole. Part 4, the systemic trap. How families, schools, and society condition the gifted child to self-abandon. Carl Jung once stated that neurosis is often the result of a soul that has been starved of meaning, not just traumatized by events. For many gifted children, it is not one single moment of betrayal or abuse that leads to their identity crisis. It's a lifetime of subtle but constant conditioning to equate value with utility and love with performance. This conditioning doesn't happen in isolation. It's embedded in family systems, school systems, and the cultural obsession with success. Let's begin with the family. Most parents don't mean to harm their gifted children. In fact, they often believe they're empowering them. But the problem is this: when a child shows early signs of excellence, whether academic, emotional, or artistic, they are quickly typecast. They become the smart one, the responsible one, the peacemaker, or the mature one. At first, these roles are flattering, but they soon become prisons. The gifted child is rarely allowed to be messy, irrational, confused, or angry. If they are the mature one, then who do they turn to when they themselves feel overwhelmed? If they are the smart one, what happens when they fail or don't understand something? These roles, once cemented, rob the child of the chance to be seen in their wholeness. In Jungian terms, the family reinforces the child's persona at the expense of their self, and because the child needs love and approval, they comply. They give up parts of themselves to maintain that attachment. Over time, they learn, I must be useful to be accepted. I must never be a burden. My needs don't matter if they interfere with what people expect of me. And these beliefs follow them into adulthood, where they become internalized narratives that drive perfectionism, people-pleasing, and emotional suppression. Now let's shift to the school system. In traditional educational environments, children are measured constantly. Tests, grades, rankings, competitions, they're all meant to quantify value. For the gifted child, this is both a playground and a war zone. On one hand, they thrive. They learn quickly, absorb information fast, and often top the charts. But on the other hand, they begin to associate achievement with identity. This association becomes dangerous when setbacks occur. A gifted child who fails a test, struggles in a subject, or gets average feedback may experience existential panic. It's not just a low grade, it's a threat to who they believe they are. Jung warned that when identity is built on externals, the ego becomes fragile, and fragility leads to anxiety, defensiveness, and shame. Schools rarely teach children how to separate performance from self-worth. Instead, they reward output. And because gifted kids often overachieve early, they are placed in higher expectations, harder classes, more responsibilities. This pressure is romanticized as potential, but what it really does is steal the child's right to grow at a human pace. The tragedy is that no one notices when the gifted child starts to suffer. Why? Because they're still performing. They're still winning awards, passing exams, being polite, Their suffering is invisible, until one day it's not, until one day they burn out, break down, or lose touch with any real joy. Add to this the layer of modern societal values and the damage compounds. We live in a culture that idolizes hustle, ambition, and high-functioning anxiety. We celebrate gifted kids who turn into successful adults, but we don't ask what that success cost them. We don't ask if they're happy, if they sleep at night, if they feel seen. Social media makes this worse. Now the gifted child is not just performing for parents and teachers, they're performing for the world. They post achievements, milestones, curated smiles. They begin to brand themselves, often unconsciously, around competence. They become terrified of slipping because they don't just fear failure, they fear erasure. If they are not excellent, will they be forgotten? If they are not impressive, will they still be loved? Jung would say that the collective psyche of our time promotes inflated ego ideals and neglects the nourishment of the soul. The result? A generation of gifted adults who feel like imposters, addicts to achievement, emotionally dissociated, and quietly suffering under the weight of their own success. Let's go deeper. Imagine a child who receives applause every time they do something beyond their years. They learn to impress adults, not connect with peers. Their language matures, but their emotional intelligence gets distorted. They become little adults, expected to be wise and calm in chaotic environments. But inside, they're still just kids who feel lost, who miss being nurtured, who don't even know what they need anymore. These children grow up with a core wound: I must be useful to be loved. And so they become the therapists, the leaders, the achievers, the caretakers. But no one is caring for them. They don't know how to receive love. They only know how to earn it. Even in romantic relationships, this dynamic shows up. They overfunction, they give and gives. They attract partners who need saving or who admire their intellect but don't engage their soul. And they feel chronically unseen because they've never been loved for who they are, only for what they can do. Jung's answer to this is not to retreat or collapse. His answer is individuation, the deep, lifelong process of unlearning the false self and discovering the true one. But this requires courage, because to individuate, the gifted adult must confront the very systems that shape them.